Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Sandro Fiore, and I'm the director of the Advanced Scientific Computing Division at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change Foundation, CMCC, and I'm very pleased today to act as moderator for this webinar. This webinar by Tommi A, co-founder and CEO of the Aekraes Codex, is about a very challenging topic. It relates to blockchains and their role in climate data quality management. So this webinar is the first of a series of webinars jointly organized by the project EUMACS, European Market for Climate Services, and Climate Europe, two projects funded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 program. So EUMACS is a 2-year research project and aims to clarify obstacles and mechanisms that affect the uptake of climate information services in various user segments. It also identifies policies and measures for climate service providers and users, as well as policymakers, which can help to overcome difficulties in market development. More information, additional material related to the climate services for finance, tourism, and urban planning are available on the project website of EUMACS. So stay tuned and have a look at the two project websites for if you're interested in following these very interesting activities. So as hosting institution, let me briefly spend a few words to introduce CMCC Foundation, which is the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. CMCC is partner of both these projects and is hosting these joint webinars among the CMCC series of webinars, which focus on a wide range of topics related to climate change sciences. So CMCC is a non-profit research organization established in 2005. It's a research center on climate change and its interactions with the environment, the society, the world of business, and policymakers. CMCC scientific activities are distributed among 8 research divisions, which share different knowledge and skills in the field of climate science. So now let me introduce the floor today of this webinar. Our speaker is Tommi A, co-founder and CEO of Aekraes Codex in Helsinki, Finland. He's also the founder and CEO of Relate Research, a company based in Helsinki, working on a new kind of high-frequency trading algorithm development platform that will be launched in 2018, this year. He's also involved in cryptocurrencies and supply chain side applications to blockchain technologies via Aekraes Codex. So before diving into the startup world, Tommi co-led the automated trading company Value Research and Trading. In the academic side, Tommi worked at the University of Helsinki and studied econometrics at the University of California, Princeton University, and Stanford University. Tommi completed his PhD degree in 2008 in financial econometrics with the award-winning thesis on elements on volatility of high frequency. He has been henceforth a frequent conference speaker on HFT and blockchain applications, and is the author of several HFT-related articles. So Tommi now writes provoking blog posts on cryptocurrencies, big data, and blockchain at aekraes.com and versusstakes.co. Then I'm also very pleased to introduce in the floor today our two discussants, Carlo Bontempo and Jesse Keenan. Carlo Bontempo is Sectoral Information System Manager at the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecast, ECMWF, in Reading, UK. Jesse Keenan is member of the faculty, area head and director of the Real Estate and Built Environment at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University in Cambridge, USA. So Carlo and Jesse will open the discussion after Tommi's presentation with some first comments on the topic and preliminary questions. Then we'll open the floor to all the registrants by selecting some of the questions that we received during the webinar. So in this regard, when posting a question to the webinar, I kindly ask the participants to specify name, affiliation, and country. And of course, I invite all the participants to be very interactive and participate in the question time. I just want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and the link to the video will be shared with all the registrants as well as uploaded to the CMCC website. So moving to today's talk, Tommi A will present the webinar, Can Blockchains Have a Role in Climate Data Quality Management? It's a very intriguing and challenging question. So Tommi will show us his perspective and will first clarify the properties and prerequisites of blockchain technology and provide some thoughts on the application in the field of climate data services. So we'll see how blockchains and climate data management can fit together, challenges, and so on. So that's it for the introduction. Now I can leave the floor to our speaker, and I will turn off also my camera and microphone. So Tommi, please, the floor is yours.
All right. So let me just open up the presentation here, and you should be able to view it Just a second. Okay, so yeah, so I've already introduced. Shortly, I would like to emphasize that in this talk, I'm representing the Aekraes side because that's the company on the blockchain applications. So we've been working for about 1 year and a little bit more on a supply chain related applications on working on top of blockchain, and so being mostly focusing on food and smart city with applications. We can discuss more about those applications later on. But yeah, I already got introduced, you know, and so my background is more on the high frequency data analytics. Been working with that since 1990s. So my approach also to the blockchain is a little bit more focused on the data side rather than from engineering point of view. So my background is not from computer science. I'm an economist by my background, so that will certainly affect also my presentation a little bit. But so let's deep dive into the subject here. So you probably heard about the blockchain before, I assume, and it belongs to a family of distributed ledgers. So the distributed ledgers are such that the data is distributed among the participants. It's a peer-to-peer network, and the differentiation to the normal databases is that it's not centralized. It's not even decentralized, as you can see in the graph, hopefully. So it's distributed. So it's a peer-to-peer network, and that's the best example is the Bitcoin network. You probably heard about the Bitcoin before. It's a financial application which basically then started all the fuss, around blockchain, and it has been grown to incredible heights, within 1 year or so. I can go later on into the reasons why it has happened, but at the moment I should emphasize that the blockchain is really a database where you have the same copy of the data distributed in the different servers all times. So it's verified to be true at all instances. So that's a different perspective to data management than the centralized server, where you would have, like in a cloud, for instance, you would have everything on a certified also sort of a security-wise certified central server, but nobody else would be able to control that. Here in the blockchain, you have a peer-to-peer network where you have the same copy of exactly the same data at all times on your server as well. So you can connect to this peer-to-peer network, and you can partly manage that network with your own little share. So that's the main differentiation between distributed ledgers and the centralized and decentralized ledgers. So in the applications world, I would like to mention that most of the companies, of course, are still running centralized or decentralized databases, and we are not suggesting that they should basically replace all of these databases immediately. The blockchain could be easily adapted to their particular use case and run beside these old database formats. So for instance, they can keep their own older centralized databases while they are actually running the distributed version. So what I mean by the shared top layer data ownership is that only part of their whole stack of data would be put into this peer-to-peer network. They could keep their own siloed databases running, whatever software they are running, and keeping their own cloud servers wherever they want to have them. But part of that data, the most important parts that they would feel most important to share with everybody else in the peer-to-peer network, would be put into the blockchain database, and that data would be shared with all the peer-to-peer members. So once again, we are not trying to replace immediately the old databases with the new kind of database, which would be most likely a little bit catastrophic. We are rather trying to have a parallel database, and then we are going to discuss what are the sort of the benefits from having such a parallel database. Right now, the problem, or the biggest problem of decentralized databases, is that once you have, for instance, a supply chain of, very large supply chain where you have maybe 50 different participants, those data that are in that supply chain tend to be siloed to different places. So you have a lot of information for one company, and they put their data into a certain silo that they only they are basically operating, and then you have the second company that have another silo, and so forth. So all these 50 companies potentially have their own data silos, which are really hard to access from any outside source, and even themselves, they could not be able to access the other company's data silo potentially. So it will be tremendously difficult to analyze such data where you have silos everywhere. And this is the first and largest benefit that the blockchain would bring to the world, basically sharing part of this data, which the participants in that ecosystem feel that they are confident that they would like to share with others. So they choose variables that they feel that they are comfortable of sharing. And you can do a lot of different blockchain solutions. One of the main confusions around blockchain is that everybody is talking about blockchain and maybe Bitcoin and so forth, without realizing that there's a wide array of blockchains available. So you can configure these blockchains very differently. There's hundreds of different blockchain solutions already, and the number is increasing. So you can, for instance, alter the privacy options in the blockchain. So you could have more anonymity or less anonymity, and that would alter, of course, what you actually see in the database. So, for instance, you could have your personal information totally to be censored, or you can have them openly visible. Anything would be up to the ecosystem to configure. So that's one of the main lessons I like to tell you firsthand, that there's a lot of different options. So once people are talking about blockchains, they should realize that there's wide array of them, and you can still develop them to any particular direction. But most of these blockchains are actually open source. You can do that yourself if you are really interested and technically involved in that. So if I would just maybe discuss a little bit about the benefits, what blockchain solutions bring at the general level to the table, because you can hear a lot of complaints that maybe it's not reasonable to use blockchain or distributed ledgers while you already have centralized solutions. That may be true in some cases, but in some cases there's certain benefits that really outweigh the losses. Of course, if you talk about supply chains, for instance, before going to the climate stuff, you could rather easily do what is called algorithmic surveillance. You could devise smart contracts which are algorithms that do certain things on them own. They would be pre-programmed algorithms that execute different things at their wish. So of course the algorithms are designed by human beings, so eventually the human beings are involved, but computer algorithms would be automizing all these decisions. So they are called smart contracts right now. They started on the Ethereum platform, but many other blockchain solutions have been doing similar features than the smart contracts. So smart contracts by name are not necessarily smart and not necessarily contracts right now. So that's the reason why I'm talking about decision algorithms. And then once you have these algorithms running on top of the blockchain solution, very highly automated solution, you can put what I call tokens on top of that. The tokens are usually necessary for a blockchain to be used, because the tokens are incentives for the servers or computer servers to be part of this peer-to-peer network. In the Bitcoin network, you would have incentives for the computer servers that they would get certain amount of bitcoins for participating in the network, doing the so-called mining, the hard work, what the computer servers have to do in order to keep this database running in live conditions. So once you have these tokens, which are totally necessary for most blockchain solutions, then you can of course incentivize other people as well to behave in certain matters. So you have tokens for you can keep tokens for doing good things, and then also penalize them for doing less good things. So you would be able to connect that to reputation, for instance. So you have, like in Amazon.com, you have 1 to 5 stars reputations, but you could make that much more complex. You would be able to give actual tokens, which would be later on exchanged to real money. And of course, thirdly, I would like to point out the integrated intelligent systems, which in short just means right now Internet of Things type of stuff. By that I mean that you could connect to the blockchain database several sensors that would automatically surveil for instance, in a smart city case, they would maybe have cameras installed or different sensors about the weather, and they would be able to report part of these data to the blockchain itself. So they could be totally integrated to the blockchain itself. They could, of course, save part of that data to the centralized databases as well, but as if it would be smart, they would be able to be saved in the blockchain as well. So this is something that is really a hot topic right now, connecting Internet of Things or artificial intelligence to the blockchain database. So just a couple of words about the autonomy here, because once you have these smart contracts or algorithms running on top of a blockchain database, you can actually design ecosystems that are self-governing. By self-governing, I mean more complex rules than just tokens. You can have different people have different kind of voting power over different, systems. So it's a sort of a nation within the nation. So you can have an ecosystem-wide regulations that are regulated not by any centralized entity, but the participants themselves. So there's no governing body necessarily. There's all the participants in the network are able to interact with each other and also regulate the ecosystem by themselves. And this can, of course, automate to a high degree. So why this is interesting? This is interesting, for instance, from the shared economy principles perspective. You have probably heard about Airbnb and such solutions that have been the core of sharing economy, or Uber or so forth. The difference between the real shared economy is that Uber, of course, is the centralized actor. It decides what happens, or Airbnb similarly. But what if you would have just a peer-to-peer network that all the participants are interacting with each other, and everything is automated and pre-programmed? All the problems, all the incentives are pre-programmed, so everybody have the full visibility of what is going to happen in different scenarios. So all the people just control the data and all the businesses themselves. There's no centralized organization that decides if this was a good solution or not. So in a sense, that's the ultimate democracy. So what is usually called the grassroots democracy. So even the smallest guy can have a voting power in this kind of ecosystem. So for instance, if you another example in supply chain, once you have a farmer that produces a really interesting product, but doesn't get the visibility in the store because they cannot really market it really well, because there's always maybe bigger marketing brands taking the attention. So you could have then much better chances of affecting the people by bringing the information to the actual consumers. The consumers would get the most relevant information and could act on that, and they could actually be buying different kind of products that they're actually now doing. So it would increase the amount of information. The true information would be increased. So even the smallest guy could have an effect to the whole. A couple of words about the risks. When you are talking about the distribution of, for instance, the power here, there's of course the risk that everything will start to centralize again, and this is actually very relevant risk. And just an example I'm bringing out this to make it a little bit more concrete. I'm just bringing out this hypothesis, which is called the Rule 3 and 4. It's by Henderson for the Boston Consulting Group. Even from it was invented in the 70s. It's like an empirical rule. There's no really theory behind it, but it means that things will start to centralize automatically if nothing is done to prevent that. So in full competition, you will most likely end up in a stable sort of equilibrium where you have the first biggest competitor having 4 times as much power as the third guy. So the second guy would have half of the power of the first guy. So as just an example to make it really more concrete, you can have a market capitalization a couple of days back from the top 3 cryptocurrencies, which were Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Ripple. And so you can see that market valuations sort of halved once you step from the first to second and from the second to third. This is what it's saying. Once you are competing fiercely in a fully competing environment, then you tend to centralize to a certain degree. So the large ones become even larger, and the smallest guys just basically disappear. So how to prevent this in the blockchain environment is a really relevant question. Right now, it's ideologically very interesting to have fully distributed power, but in the end, it may happen that some of the power actually ends up in a few hands, so to speak. And you have already seen that. Maybe if you have been following the Bitcoin mining community, there have been appearing really large pools of miners that have actually, well, there are groups of miners that have actually got a lot of affluence in that ecosystem. So the similar thing could happen, of course, in a not so well governed ecosystem, so that people could collude with themselves and form groups that could actually start to imitate more like decentralized or centralized community. So as a more concrete example, you already have some of this happening. You have patents that are being patented by large corporations on blockchain. Just to name a few, Bank of America, IBM, MasterCard are among the top patenters in this world right now. So it started open source, but now it has moved to a direction where large corporations are able to put patents on these things. And of course, that may lead at some point to a case that you have a little bit more centralized ecosystem than ideally you would like to have. That's up to you, of course, in the ecosystem, how to design the ecosystem and the governing rules. So let's go into the data quality, which is sort of my background as well. So just shortly, I would like to remind that I'm working on financial applications. In finance, it's really important to have high quality data. So there in finance, you have asynchronous observations, so they're not homogeneously spaced in time, and you have very accurate timestamp, even to the precision of nanosecond. So you would like to have these kind of things going on in the database, definitely in the blockchain database as well. So you want to take some example from the finance field, for instance, where you have a really precise and high quality data nowadays. Another thing is the transparency which the blockchain tries to bring forward. So you would have a wide information dissemination, which means that all of this information that is put in the blockchain, sort of the top layer shared database, is visible to all the participants. So you could, if you just take an example again, like the Bitcoin example, you would be able to go and see who or what parties are doing the transactions in the Bitcoin space. Similarly, if there would be some data to be put into the database, like related to climate, for instance, you would be able to see the participants, not necessarily the names, but their identity or the public key, that they are using. So the key here is that there's more transparency in the blockchain space than in a centralized database. Centralized database would be totally controlled by some centralized party. In the distributed version, nobody really owns the data. It's owned by the whole ecosystem itself. So once you have this kind of data that's more openly available, of course, you can more easily verify processes. You can audit things from outside. You can see that actually it is happening what the companies are saying, and you don't have to trust their word. You can actually see an open database. You can audit yourself. So the transparency is very, very important part of blockchains. The other part that is really important is trust. So you want to have immutable data, something that cannot be changed later. I mean, this is technically done by blockchain. So once you put something in the blockchain, it is there forever, basically. Nobody can alter that database later on. So you cannot really hack that database. You cannot change the data. You can make new additions to the data, but what is put to the database exists there forever. So once you put all this stuff together, the data quality, transparency, and trust, you would have what we would call in financial markets, really high or extreme market efficiency. The prices in financial markets would reflect all available information. Similarly, in any other industry, having the transparent, trustworthy data would increase, activity in economic sense. So you will be able to trust somebody in transactions. You would be able to trust the data. So when does blockchain then work? I mean, if I'm talking about trust and transparency, obviously where you have most chances are in the parts of the world which in this map are in the red or in the dark red. And this is a little bit old, map, but the same general impression exists. So you have parts of Europe that are really on the blue terrain, which are sort of the trustworthy nations, at least according to this corruption index. And then you have large parts of the world in the red. And the blockchain really works best once you are in the red, where there exists a little trust, or you are moving something from an untrustworthy part of the world, for instance, to a trustworthy part. So why is that? Of course, if you live in a trustworthy part where there's little corruption, you would like to do business maybe with some other part of the world, but you cannot trust, the data perhaps, what they are trying to convey to you. So it would increase the business chances if you would be able to trust these other parties as well. So it's really the key that in the blockchain that you would like to have in the ecosystem parties that do not trust themselves. If they are really good partners, friends, maybe family, you have little incentive to use blockchain. You would like to use blockchain in a case where you have little trust. Similarly, you would like to, it would be the easiest to use blockchain once you have a high use of smart mobiles, for instance. So here we have table where you have China, India, United States, and so forth, the biggest nations, the most people in them, and then you have high percentages of the smartphone penetration, and in the last column you see the actual number of smartphone users. So you can see that there's over 700 million in China, and India with 300 million, and so forth. So of course, the best chances are for blockchain usage when you have a smartphone, because you would like to interact with the high tech itself. If you don't have a smartphone, it is a little bit harder of course, to communicate with the database that it's a blockchain. So that's my point here. So the ideal cases for blockchain usage is where there's little trust, and you would have sort of inexpensive, convenient way to integrate with the blockchain database. So let's just kind of spend a couple of minutes then on the climate data management itself, because that's sort of the key topic here. This is a quote from World Meteorological Organization, and they are saying that in the long term, high quality, reliable climate instrument at times there's a key information. Of course, that's obvious. That's obvious also in finance. That's in most fields that's the key thing to do. You need to have high quality, reliable data in order to, for instance, to use artificial intelligence algorithms. If you have, suboptimally placed data with wrong information, artificially intelligent algorithms do not do much. If you have a car that is autonomically driven, if it gets wrong inputs, it will clearly make the wrong decisions. So it's really key to have this high quality, reliable climate instrumental time series in order to make climate decisions very well. So the benefits in the climate would be, of course, in the climate monitoring and maybe the risk management of future problems ahead. So you would have different kind of forecasts for climate disasters, and you need high quality data in order to make these predictions. So once again, if you have really smart, intelligent algorithms, for instance, artificially intelligent, they are not going to be any good if you have a high quality data. So similar to studies and predictions, of course, in a more academic fashion would benefit from a trustworthy data. And similarly, also the satellite data, you would like to have a very well calibrated satellite data, and the benefits are clear in these three cases. And then I've taken some examples from one meteorological journal, just to make it more concrete, that they're actually talking about these issues without actually referring to blockchain. So the reason why I'm really taking these quotes is that they have solved these issues by more centralized solution, but now I'm suggesting to consider the blockchain solutions. So what they are saying in that journal, for instance, in that paper, is that more and more data are coming in, and you need to be combining with that other factors. So again, if you have really siloed perspective into the ecosystem, so one company records one type of data and another company saves another kind of data, they might not have access to those data that they both record in separately. So if you have 100 different companies, different entities recording the data to different places, it's very hard to analyze. So the blockchain is a step forward, and it's a shared ledger for these things. Once you put all the information in one place, it's easier to make educated decisions. Of course, like I said, this is related to IoT, for instance. So it's automatic electronic instrumentation. So you would like to connect the blockchain database with something like smart devices. So you would like to automatically have some data from let's say from farms, from agricultural fields, or anything related to climate, for that matter, for any sensors that would be not controlled actually by humans. They would be devised by humans, but they would be automatically just carrying out the orders, so to speak. So they would be more reliable in that sense than maybe human-to-human decisions that would make it easier, or errors a little bit more easy. So of course, there has been then difficulties as well. I mean, of course, these national meteorological services, they are not necessarily really well financed, and they have some of their data on paper records, so they need to digitalize in any case this stuff. So the solution needs to be somewhat low cost and sustainable. I understand that. So some blockchain solutions are quite expensive to execute. So if you look at Bitcoin, for instance, you probably heard that they have quite high fees already, and it's a little bit slow and so forth. It's not really ideal for practical applications. But then you have to remember that there's really a wide array of blockchain solutions. So there's new blockchains coming up, and there already exist better solutions than the Bitcoin network, much faster solutions, and less energy incentive solutions. So the Bitcoin proof of work concept, or the protocol that it uses, it takes a lot of energy, electricity, to keep the network running. But you have different blockchains that use much less energy. So you have to keep in that mind. And once you have application in mind, you just have to pick up the correct or the suitable blockchain for that particular use case. In the Bitcoin's case, the benefit is that it has a really powerful network. It's really stable. It's almost impossible to switch it off. No government could do that because it's so widely distributed. And of course, this is then related to how easy it is to get the information, how easy is it to lose information. So back in the maybe 10 years or 20 years ago, you had some hard disks that would have failures and you would lose all the information. In the blockchain space, it's really less likely to lose information. Why? Because it's a distributed peer-to-peer network. The same copy always exists on the other servers as well. So the wider your ecosystem or the network is, the less likely or almost impossible to get rid of that data. That can be, of course, good and bad thing. If you would like to lose some information, it's really unlikely to lose that information in the blockchain universe anymore. And that would bring me to the regulations in the European Union, where they actually have are in this May are putting forward regulations concerning the privacy of people. So that regulation basically says that you should allow people to have high anonymity if they want to have anonymity. They should be able to get rid of history in databases that exist. So that was directed to us, Facebook and big companies like that. But of course, it sort of contradicts with the blockchain principle in a way, because once something information is in blockchain, it's going to remain there. So I expect there's going to be some work to be done in this field as well from the legal side. But the notable thing is that it's really hard to get rid of the information once you put it in the blockchain. And of course, that's according to the rules that govern that ecosystem or the blockchain space in that particular case. So you can decide within that ecosystem how you're gonna solve different use cases. So I'm just gonna give you a couple of links if you are more interested in the climate related things. Maybe this will create some discussion later on as well. So for instance, you have how blockchain relates to the sharing economy, like I already shortly mentioned to you. And then you have in different countries, you have sort of roundtables and a lot of different pilots going on, how you're going to use blockchain in energy and climate related things. Many of those are private. They have not been revealing much information from their pilots. But I expect that's going to happen within this year. So more and more information about the pilots or the performance of those pilots are going to be coming up pretty soon. And a lot of different entities like European Union and UN and so forth are supporting the application of blockchain. Not necessarily Bitcoin and the financial applications, but the blockchain which is behind applications like Bitcoin. So this is basically then just the information page for my company, and there's a couple of blog posts related to the blockchain itself if you are interested in reading. There are more maybe philosophical than I have the time to speak about here, but I recommend that you would have a look if you are more interested in the deeper repercussions of blockchain. So I think I will stop here for a moment and then see if the discussions have any comments, and maybe there's questions from the audience, and we can then maybe answer in more detail any concerns that you have.
Thanks a lot, Tommi. Very, very interesting presentation. So there are several aspects, I'm sure, that will stimulate the discussion. So thanks again. So I would open the floor to our discussants now. I kindly invite Carlo Bontempo from ECMWF to start with some first comments on the topic and preliminary questions, and then I will ask the same to Jesse Keenan from Harvard University. So please, Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandro, and thank you, Tommi, for a very interesting webinar. Clearly is something I'm not an expert on, so there was a lot of learning on my side. I'm working on the climate aspect, and in particular, I'm managing a part of a large European program on climate services. So I try to make climate information useful and actionable by end users. So definitely beyond the weather. So some of the points you mentioned about the weather information probably are slightly less relevant to me. But certainly there are a few points that resonated with me in relation to the traceability and the quality of the data. This is certainly an important issue when you want to build services on the back of climate information. You want to be sure that the information you're using is of good quality, and you want to ensure that any post-process of those data is still of good quality. So I guess one question would be related to how the blockchain technology can be used to that. But before that question, I have a more specific one, and is related to another point you made, which is the fact that you don't want to maintain a high quality time series of observation in just one location, because it's too dangerous in a sense. If you lose that lost forever. And you sort of suggested the use of the Bitcoin or the blockchain technology as a way of minimizing that risk. But in the community, the climate community, we are used to this ESGF, the Earth System Grid Federation, where the same simulation, the one that underpin IPCC report, are actually mirrored and shared in different locations, different servers. And that's already a good way of mitigating that risk. So my question is, how different the blockchain technology would be, and how much more secure would be with respect to the normal mirroring of data set that is typically done within the community?
Well, I mean, that's hard to put like any number on that. It's sort of it depends on the use case. If you have really the if it's really necessary or beneficial to start using a blockchain. The benefit in the blockchain, I would say, is that you would already have an existing solution. You would just have to connect to that database, so you wouldn't have to actually build up your own systems or any mirroring devices or so forth. So you would just basically use an existing database, and you basically just outsource the data to something somewhere else, and then you would be absolutely sure that it actually exists in the right format. So technically speaking, why blockchain started to become a really big thing around Bitcoin was that they solved this called double spending problem. So one transaction or one token or one cryptocurrency could only happen once. So you would be able to only for sure utilize your token, for instance, for one particular time. You would not be able to utilize that for a second time, and that's cryptographically proven. So I think you would have some risks related to this in the mirroring scene. I'm not saying that it would be a big problem in your application, but certainly once it becomes more involved with maybe with money or something that could be potentially hacked, or somebody could claim that they actually have the true Bitcoin, it would be much harder to prove in your case that, or the mirroring case, that it actually, what is the actual truth. So this was the critical part of why Bitcoin and why blockchain itself became huge success, or have been becoming, like in a couple of last years. So I think that this is technically the reason it is backed up by cryptographic proofs, and then I would at least like to mention that, and of course the usability, or the easiness of connecting to a sort of outsourced database.
Thank you. May I have another question?
Yeah.
That's more rapid and more to the point. Is there, I mean, typically in the climate community, we are dealing with what we think are large data set, which depending, I mean, there is not such a thing as of a large data set. It really depends on the context. But for us, probably, I mean, our center is producing something in the order of 8 petabytes of data per year that gets in the archive. Is there any upper limit to the data size for their use within a blockchain technology?
I mean, it's kind of the reason why there's this why people don't record a lot of data is that it needs to be verified in the network, and it can be highly time-consuming to transfer large bytes of data around the world. So of course, before there are solutions that are sort of called lightning fast, it is really the intention right now that you only record part of your data and keep the sort of your images and so forth in your centralized databases. So the intention right now is not to put all the information into the database that uses blockchain, but rather part of that. About the upper limit, I mean, the technology is improving all the time, so it's very hard to say if this is actually upper limit. I don't think there's an upper limit in that technical sense, but you have to consider the fact that if you have a Bitcoin network with thousands of computers around the world, and they have to verify the transactions between the different peers. So one peer is in Australia, and one of them is, for instance, in Italy. So that's a long distance already, physically speaking. So there's this kind of there are solutions that are being thought out that would at least partly solve the amount of data problem. So it's related to this kind of scaling problem that it's going on in the community that's been discussed for a couple of years, and that relates to also the fact how fast you can verify things. So Bitcoin, for instance, started to be quite fast network for verifying and recording things, but now it has come to the point that it is quite slow. So it all depends, on the size of the network itself and how it's technologically, built up. So, like I said, there's different blockchains, and there's new blockchain solutions that come with different, more innovative ways to solve these scaling problems. So I don't think there's upper limit for data. It just doesn't really make sense to record all of your stuff currently there. Hopefully that's partly answers your questions on that.
Thank you.
So Jesse, please.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for having me, and thank you for a very informative presentation. And I'll jump right into, from my perspective, the range of potential applications. Although I do want to pick up on this last point in terms of upper limits and the speed and and scalability function. I do think it is worth acknowledging, given the computational demands in terms of energy, that this is something that is potentially quite maladaptive in many ways if one were to think about many broader applications. As it stands now, at least in terms of cryptocurrency applications, the energy parity in terms of the value function associated with authenticity and the like is extraordinarily maladaptive in broader terms. But assuming that the technology advances at the rate that we would anticipate that it would in terms of advancements for authentication, I think one of the highlights of your presentation was that relating to contractual applications. And I think in terms of derivatives, as well as parametric insurance contracts, in fact, it's probably already being experimented with, I would think, in the derivative world, where you have very clear points of exchange or trigger points associated with certain phenomenon that have very specific measurements and quantifications that are somewhat independent of the value or pricing structure associated with derivative contracts. In my world, primarily oriented towards material investment, the built environment, and the like, one of the reasons that blockchain came to mind, so there's a world of insurance and sort of high finance applications where I think this has immediate application. I think what is another challenge is for those of us who are engaged in the construction management operations and more fundamentally the design and engineering of the built environment, as well as adaptation and resilience interventions thereof, there's a major challenge. And in fact, I think a broader design challenge, maybe not even for the built environment, for products in general, is the extent to which risk sharing and transfer by and between different parties, assuming different types of design risks. So just by example, if one is asked to design a water management system or a building, engineers historically have more or less their liability has extinguished upon the delivery of that building unless there's some critical negligence function associated with life safety. But generally the life cycle performance associated with that building is not a risk that is carried forward in terms of professional services. We're starting to see scope of work in terms of contracts and professional services that are actually taking on risks associated with with climate change impacts, hazards, as well as from both a stress point of view, but also from a shock point of view, and the stochastic interaction between shocks and stresses on life cycle analysis. And I think one of the major problems is, and if you think about the construction of a very, let's say, large, complicated, multilateral infrastructural system where you have multiple parties, I think it's very difficult at this juncture for parties to have an agreed upon unit or metric of an associated trigger point associated with their, let's say, consensus behind what is a data point driving a certain decision. And one of the applications that I think is perhaps a secondary or collateral stage in years from now is that essentially contracts which share this risk can be pegged to a specific point in time and a specific data source, so that for future litigation, for future risk transfer, sharing, management, etc., there's an agreed upon understanding that there was a reliance, and this is the key point, a certain reliance on that data set at that point in time. Because if there's a shifting or let's say if there's a lack of consensus or a lack of understanding about what is the most appropriate, let's say, data set or methodology or whatever the output may be from the underlying evaluation associated with climate services, if whatever ambiguity that may exist there, and we can think of a lot of different types of ambiguity, that ambiguity is a function of risk, either in terms of assessment, diagnosis, prognosis, whatever that may be in terms of the delivery of professional services. The implication is that that risk adds transactional costs, and that cost adds additional, let's say, unnecessary costs associated with the underlying efficiency as well as effectiveness of the performance of the risk transfer associated with professional service delivery. So I don't want to take up too much time. I know we're running close here to the end in many ways, but I do think that in the short term, both the insurance, the parametric insurance world, as well as financial derivatives can really start utilizing this. My fundamental concern then really goes back to how we balance the value associated with blockchains relative to the ongoing intensity of its energy and computational intensity.
Yeah. I mean, just a quick comment on the energy front. I mean, it's at least most of the people always refer to this proof of work protocol once they're actually talking about the energy problems that come up with the Bitcoin network, which is a proof of work protocol network. And there's different protocols already existing. So there's a stake based protocols and so forth, which just mean that they need less computer power to verify the transactions of the data. So there's already several cases. For instance, Ethereum is much looking forward to change the sort of the energy costful proof of work concept to another concept that would be on stake basis. So there's already existing movement towards that more energy efficient solution, the blockchain space. So it's just kind of a Bitcoin happens to be the first one that applied the proof of work, and that was the most sort of obvious concept to be used. But there's a lot of different solutions already, and also like to emphasize that once you have like a private solution, like for a smaller network, then of course it's nowhere near to the energy cost of a larger network. But of course, there's a trade-off in the sense that the larger network you have, the more trustworthy the network, so to speak, comes. I mean, it's a really open network. So I mean, you are right in the sense that there's a trade-off in a certain extent. So you have to balance with the energy against the trustworthiness of the network. And the purists from the Bitcoin world would claim that their network is clearly the best, and that it actually has a good purpose, even though it's taking a lot of energy. But I think also the what is called the hard forks right now in the Bitcoin community already show that there's a movement, or there's a disparity between the people in the Bitcoin community, that they actually think a little bit differently within that community, and they want to provide different solutions. And one of them is definitely the energy side of it. So I totally agree that it needs to be solved, but I would say that it has been partly solved already.
Yeah, so one final point, at least on my end, relating to that, and I have faith that the pace of advancement will minimize my concerns as to those trade-offs. Relating to the relative size of network and the distributive application, I think my comments prior were related to a commercial context, but I also think that there's consumer applications as well, particularly in the mortgage and primary insurance world, the extent to which internal networks relating to mortgage delivery and finance and consumer finance that is pegged or associated with specific types of risk relating to climate hazards and exposure, as well as socioeconomic vulnerability. I think there's also a tremendous opportunity in terms of consumer application.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thanks a lot to our discussants and speakers. So we got several questions from the participants. Some of them were related to the aspects that our discussants already highlighted very well in their comments. So I'm just picking up one question for Tommi. As we move toward the decentralized approach to climate solutions, how can we move toward data format uniformity, interoperability worldwide, while still inviting broad distributed participation?
Well, yeah, I mean, sort of the standardization, and if you prefer to so we have been working with, with several companies and in different ecosystems, and one of the key, of course, challenges is that once you try to build up an ecosystem, you have to have some common understanding what you are going to do. So what kind of data is actually interesting and in what format? So what variables are of key interest? So that is clearly a challenge, that once you have maybe hundreds of different companies or entities within that ecosystem, you have to agree on certain things. What variables are going to be recorded? And if you change your mind within that ecosystem, is it dynamically adjusted? So if you only want to, record a couple of different variables, what if you in the next 2 weeks you want to change them? So that is something that I referred in this presentation with the sort of the self-governing system. So you would be able, in ideal case, you would have like a voting power, and the different people would have different voting power. For instance, in the state world, the more you have different tokens, the more power you would have to vote. Or in a totally uniform case, all the participants would have one token with which they would vote for different decisions. So they could, within that ecosystem, decide themselves, if they want to have the different variables to be changed to another set of variables. So I think the standardization is really at the core of adapting these kind of distributed networks, because you need to have reasonable common understanding what you are going to do. And that's the interesting aspect, and that's the sort of experimental aspect of blockchain. And that's also why I say that it can possibly lead to centralization, because different groups may have different voting powers. So it would, in the worst case, end up close to the existing world, where different powerful participants would be able to say how the ecosystem actually works, and currently the challenge is really to set up rules in that ecosystem that would be enable a democratic, more democratic approach to choosing or doing standardization. And I don't know how difficult it's going to be, but that's one of the main experimental factors in blockchain, and I think that we are going to find out within the next 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, I think to that point, with the centralizing hypothesis, what we haven't perhaps acknowledged is the proposition of the authenticity associated with otherwise authenticating incorrect data. So what happens when the data is wrong, but we've otherwise invested in its authentication? What is the and somehow there's a psychocognitive biasing associated with our perception of the validity of that data because it has been otherwise accepted by a group or a set of value chains inherent in it? And to what extent is there a proposition for a broader oversight as to the nature of truth? So I think that this is a much more problematic proposition.
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, that's partly the solution is to move from human to human interactions, like the paper world, into a more automatic world where you will have robots actually writing the records. But then of course you could claim that they could be hacked, or some kind of wrong information would be input to the blockchain. And I totally agree that that's a relevant question. I mean, right now what they have done in the Bitcoin, sort of the cryptocurrency world, they have done what is called a hard fork. So if they had a really serious mistake, like a hack of some sort in some centralized database like an exchange, they might actually want to hard fork or change the history, or basically start fresh from the sort of the wrong data point. So it would fork into the old existing database which existed with the hack, and then the new database with the clean start where the hack didn't exist. So this is one solution, but it's pretty costly. So I totally agree that they have to come up with a way how to deal with erroneous inputs, or the data that is later on seen to be incorrect or unjustified in some form.
Thank you, Tommi. I will pick up just the final question, which is sort of looking forward. So, by Maurizio Ferrari, does blockchain technology play a role in citizen science and climate data, or could it play a role in the future? What's your opinion?
Oh, in climate, with respect to climate data.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it's well, we've been in discussions with for instance, with respect to the satellite data. So I think that's going to be, at least from our perspective, really interesting to combine different data sets with each other. For instance, supply chain with satellite data and so forth. So I think the future, what it holds, what can be important with respect to the climate data as well, that you want to combine different data sets that have been previously siloed to different places. I think there's a tremendous value unlocked in different places, that there's so much data in different parts of the world, but it's hard to reach. So once you get that analyzed together in combination, I think it's gonna make some forecasts much more precise and increase our understanding of different phenomena. I think also in weather, although it's a tremendously difficult topic to analyze, I know that, but I think combining different data is the way to go. And then the problem is going to be, how do you combine huge data sets? So you need to do some smart pre-filtering before you combine these data sets, and that's again, the question is that what is the core information that you want to record, and what is sort of the lesser value, what is considered to be noise, and what is the core information that you would like to combine with different other data sources. So I think that's, at least at the general level, I think that's also the way to go in climate data. Do you want to combine different data sources?
Thank you so much. Carlo, Jesse, do you want to add anything else with regard to this question?
No, I think the answer was quite clear in that respect. I found the seminar, as I mentioned, very interesting, and I'm sure there will be more opportunities in the future to expand further the use of blockchain technology within climate services, especially in relation to data quality and traceability of the data set.
Yeah, I think my final comment would be that I think that this is, in a year from now, I think we'll be probably in a pretty different place than where we are today. I think this is moving really quite quickly. I think from a trans-jurisdictional or multi-jurisdictional point of view, the integration between markets or instruments and markets associated with this has some very low-lying fruit. My concerns relate more to decision-making and the associated extent to which we authenticate not only the chain of custody and the other associated aspects, but we speak to the notion of internal validity associated with the data that we're utilizing, and how that is being projected for its ambiguities to those that need to make decisions based on this information. So I think it's one thing to have a measurement, a satellite going directly into a data set. It's a whole other thing to have a human interface. And I think that it will be some time before we fully accommodate the variabilities, the errors, and the biases associated with human interface of data for this purposes. But that being said, this is something that will probably keep many of us, and perhaps all of us in the world of climate change, engaged as part of our analytical mission for years to come.
Thanks a lot. It's a good reason also to have another webinar on this topic, maybe in a few months from now. So thanks a lot. So I think we reached pretty much the end of this webinar today. So we got several questions that unfortunately will not be able to manage today, but we'll forward to all the questions to our speaker for any possible follow-up. Let me remind you that the webinar has been recorded, and the link to the video will be shared with all the registrants, as well as uploaded to the CMCC website. Our next CMCC webinar will be on water management, innovative ways to assess precipitation spatial distribution, and it will be held on May 29 and 12:30. by Paula Marsson from the Climate Simulation and Prediction Division of CMCC. So I invite all of you to join this webinar as well. So before leaving, let me thank again all of you, in particular our speaker, Tommi Vuorenmaa, and our discussants, Carlo Buontempo and Jesse Keenan. Thank you very much. We very much appreciated your contribution to this webinar today. And thanks also to all the participants. We had about 100 registrants today, so I think it was a very successful webinar, and we can maybe plan also for another one in the next future. So once more, thanks to all of you, and stay tuned with our next events. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.